took me to a doctor when I was about 3 years old, as I was highly strung. I was always crying, and in fact my family nickname was the Waterworks. The doctor put me on a tonic, which, because you didn't diagnose depression back in the 60s, especially not to a 3-year-old child. But what the doctor and my parents didn't realise is that I was being sexually abused by my oldest brother. See, I'm 11th of 12 children, and in a family that size, it's really easy to get lost. So around the same time, amongst all the trauma and fear, something magical happened. I was given this read-along book of Mary Poppins. And for those of you old enough to remember them, there's a vinyl record inside, and you play it, and when it's time to turn the page, Tinkerbell rings a bell, and you turn the page. So this little bit of bliss was how I learned to read and to escape abuse in my own childlike way. I started reading everything I could find, and I began to separate myself from the little girl who was being abused. I felt sorry for her, but while she was suffering, I was safe up in the magic faraway tree with Dame Washalot or with Moonface. And I was having a tea party on the ceiling with Jane and Michael Banks from Mary Poppins. So as I got older, I started to become part of the Secret Seven and the Famous Five, and the abuse continued, but I was able to separate myself from it and escape into fantasy, and that kept me alive. I grew up probably more normal than I deserved to be. I got married and had my first baby, a little girl called Amy. She was closely followed by Lachlan and Stuart, and the four of us revelled in fantasy. I taught them all my favourite songs like Puff the Magic Dragon and the Emerald City. And we watched everything Disney and everything not Disney. We lost ourselves in Andy's bedroom in Toy Story. We swam under the sea with Ariel and the Little Mermaid. When Amy got to name a puppy for somebody else, it was Aurora, named after the Sleeping Beauty. So we were a family inspired by fantasy. But I wasn't particularly happy in my marriage, and I started acting in amateur theatre and lost myself in the thrill of it again. You can start to see a pattern forming. I get out whenever I can. So watching a scene come to life fascinated me. The words, the costumes, the props, the sets. It was just another form of magic. And then things started to get worse in the marriage, and it became violent, and I ended it. So the trouble was my ex-husband thought I was his property, so he didn't want the marriage to end. And I spent 4.5 years in and out of family law court and being stalked and harassed. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing over my bed with scissors in his hand saying he'd already killed the children, or he'd burnt the granny flat that my mum was in to the ground and she was in it as well. Every access visit he would tell me that he was going to put the kids in a car and kill them, and no matter how much the court heard this story, they would do nothing, and they insisted that access take place. One night I was at a housewarming party and there was a knock on the door, and it was the police. They told me that my children were in an accident with their father. Lachlan, my middle son, my oldest son, middle child, had head injuries, but he would live. Stuart, my baby, was in a coma with massive brain swelling, and they weren't sure what the outcome would be there. And that night, my daughter got her angel wings. So you'd think that would have stopped the harassment, but it didn't. I spent the next year in and out of court, still being harassed and stalked, and life was just a nightmare. When it came time for him to go to court for her death, they couldn't prove that it wasn't an accident, no matter what. They couldn't bring all the previous family law court stuff into that court. So he had his licence suspended for 6 months and got a $1,000 fine. The boys and I got a life sentence. I tried to throw myself back into anything that would take me out of the pain I was in, but nothing worked. I went back to acting. I decorated the boys' room in the most over-the-top fantasy, amazing themes. I wish I had them now. And while it worked for a short time, the agony never left. And then, just as Jackie Paper did to Puff the Magic Dragon, my boys grew up. And suddenly my reasons for living didn't need me in the same way anymore. I didn't know what to do or even who I was. And that's when I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. I got confused easily, lost concentration, cried occasionally, but more often than not, I just stepped outside of my emotions and just become completely numb. Eventually unable to work, always terrified I'd run into him somewhere, I decided to shift from house to house. We were always frightened of being found by him, and I just never settled. You know, I couldn't settle anywhere. I was so unhappy. So I decided to make a change, and having grown up near the beach in Victoria, I decided on a tree change, and I shifted to the Blue Mountains. I loved it here, I still do, but I couldn't see that life held a lot of pleasure, and I lived it more often than not in the third party. An uninvolved onlooker, just waiting to grow old and die. Then one very angry day, I had a little bit of a meltdown and I decided I was going to write a book about my life and out every mongrel that had ever hurt me. My son, in his wisdom, decided that it might be better if I write a blog and just slow things down a little bit. So I did. He helped me start a blog about my life, and that started gaining momentum. I won a few awards, and then I sort of started to think, I probably should stop stealing pictures from Google to populate it. And I decided I needed to take better photographs. So I took myself off to TAFE in Penrith, and there was a course in Cert 4 in photo imaging, and within a few weeks I'd fallen in love. I'd always enjoyed photography, but I suddenly became absolutely obsessed with it. I started to always look for the perfect frame scene. And it's a funny thing when you look for the negative in life and the bad things in life, you're going to find them. That's a given. But when you start looking for beauty, it is absolutely everywhere. And suddenly through my lens, a broken shopping trolley took on a new lease of life. I saw the world through new eyes, and it was just like a veil had been lifted. And any of you that have seen Tangled will know that's a quote from there. I went on to complete my diploma, and that's when I started to really make images instead of taking pictures. So one day I was sitting at my computer just playing when I stopped trying to force something to happen, and I put my ego aside and just let my soul take over. And suddenly there was a mermaid in front of me. And I called that mermaid Hope, because when the world says give up, Hope whispers try one more time, and I did. So I started returning to the safe place of my childhood and creating the friends who kept me safe. Mermaids, angels, fairies, even the banshee, because I did grow up with an Irish grandmother who insisted it was the banshee howling every night, not the greyhound farm down the road. So they all started to take their rightful place back in my life and in my heart, but in a much more grounded and realistic way. I knew now they weren't real, most of the time. So most importantly though, I started to build me back again. I started to put the pieces back together. So I decided to form a body of work based on my life, but told as a fairy tale. And last year, in the middle of working on it, the universe decided to test me one more time. And on my, what should have been Amy's 33rd birthday, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I was not in a good mood. And I said to my son on the way home, why? Why choose today of all days? And he said, Mum, it's the perfect day. You've lived through losing her. This is a reminder that you can live through this, and this is just a tiny blip in the radar of your life. And it just put everything into perspective. I don't know where he got his wisdom from. It ain't from me, and it certainly ain't from his father. So it just really helped me to put everything in perspective. So during treatment, I kept creating, and on what would have been Amy's 34th birthday this year, exactly a year after diagnosis, From Fractured to Fairytale opened its doors, and it was an installation exhibition. You walk through the cover of a book and into my life with the pages, fairy tale pages, theatre, all sorts of things in there. I know it was really confronting for a lot of people, as there's a lot of trauma there, obviously, and it was confronting for me, and it was really confronting for my sons, because when we both walked in, or they walked in and myself, we'd never seen my life in that context before, in that small space. And while I'd done all the work, they hadn't seen it all. So they were really quite distressed by it, but on the same token, it was one of the most healing things we'd all been through. And they helped me get it all up and running and, you know, set it up and all those sorts of things. And I think it became one of the most healing things we could have done as a family, because even though not all of it was their life, most of it was. And they've lived with the damage that was caused by the parts that wasn't them. So I hope when people came through, they found what I saw, or they saw what I found, sorry, and that is that through art and fairy tales, I finally found my own happily ever after.